bilingualism has been a topic of intense attention, so both in sort of scientific circles and in popular media in the last, I would say, 3 to 4 decades. And part of the reason for that is that, the world is just getting globalized. So, there is internet, we're getting in touch with more people, so it's just becoming more and more obvious this sort of, other people speaking other languages and the need to communicate. But even without those sort of more recent advances, there are things like this. I should just sort of put a few numbers here for you to have a look. So there is something like 6,000 languages that have been identified around the world for something like 190 independent countries. And just putting those two figures next to each other is going to make it obvious that there are going to be people in these countries that are speaking more than one language. So you can think of countries that have multiple official languages, so Switzerland or India, for instance. And some of these languages are going to be huge, so they're going to have millions or billions of speakers. Some are going to be tiny. They're just going to have a family, a region, village, but multiple languages as being spoken. And there are estimates that there are probably more bilingual than monolingual speakers in the world. And if we look at how the EU is doing, you can see it's not doing too badly. So there are these occasional surveys that are done. And one from 2012 seems to suggest that, or show rather, that there is over half of the general population that can communicate in another language, to some extent. I mean, they're not fully proficient and fully balanced, but they can use another language. And then if we look at the younger populations of students, this really shoots up. This goes to something like 80%. So as a result of these things, we are, have more and more children that are sort of growing up in an environment where bilingualism is sort of their first language, if you want. So you'd basically, have this context where one parent speaks one language, another parent speaks another language, and then from the onset, kids are used to this idea that there are sort of two sets of labels for the same thing. So depending on who you talk to, it's going to, you're going to need to use a different word. And as I was just showing you now, obviously there is going to be a number of children who are growing up in this sort of environment where one parent speaking one language, another parent speaking another language. And these bilinguals, well, these kids, they tend to, statistically, not necessarily in every single case, but they sort of tend to grow up into fully proficient bilinguals that are balanced, that can sort of effortlessly switch between their languages, to the frustration of all us others who are really struggling to learn that second language fluently. And then there is a whole other set of scenarios in which people are going to acquire a second language later in life. So obviously, you're going to have children who are learning at some point in their education, and this is going to depend on which education system they attend. So this can be at age of 5 or 15, or anything in between. And then there are adults who would be learning language at some point later in life because they're either particularly interested, or they are, say, moving from one country to another, so they need to, for personal or job reasons. So they need to learn the second language in order to sort of function in that environment. Or there are going to be people who don't have the choice. So basically, the refugees that are going to be moving to another country and need to learn the second language to some extent. And they are known as sequential bilinguals. So they're acquiring their languages one after another. And these are, these sort of obvious points to make. So this is something that you would know from everyday experience. But I'm flagging this up to make this point that bilinguals are a very, very heterogeneous group. So there are going to be differences in how early people have started learning the second language, why they are doing it, how they feel about it, how proficient they are, how often they use their first and second language, and so on. And all of those are necessary to take into account when one is thinking about what possible effects this does have on one's cognition. So sort of being able to talk to someone in their language is normally going to get people to sort of better understand where people are coming from. So you know their set of beliefs and you understand them a little bit better. So there is that obvious advantage. Job prospects. So someone speaking English and Spanish and German and French, for instance, is going to be in a much better position when they're trying to find a job, comparing to a person who only speaks one language. So again, fairly is obvious point. Travel opportunities and so on. So this all sort of, again, makes perfect sense in that sort of greater social context. Every time I learn something new, it pushes some old stuff out of my brain. I mean, it's nonsense. There is just no other way to put it. Our brains don't operate that way. So it's not the case that, you know, if you learn how to drive, you're going to forget how to make vegetable soup. It's just simply not. Brains have this sort of amazing capacity to adapt. So you can learn all sorts of things and, you know, this is what we're going to be looking at. But this was pretty thoroughly debunked, this sort of way of thinking, as I'll show you. So we have this sort of evidence that bilinguals are suppressing one language. And that is going to serve as a sort of mental gym, if you want. So that's going to exercise this ability to suppress information that's irrelevant at any particular context. And that's going to get you better at doing that particular task. So obviously you can sort of, you know, suppress the irrelevant language and focus on the correct one. But then critically, the argument goes, this is going to generalize across domains. So it's not just going to be applicable in the language context, but in any context where there is some interfering information, some competing information that needs to be suppressed. You need to focus on A and suppress B in order to do the task. So, you know, situations like you're down like in a bar, and then you're trying to focus on your friend who's talking something, and there's someone else shouting in your ear at the same time. So that is competing information, and that, according to this argument, is going to be improved by the experience of bilingualism. So metalinguistic knowledge it's not knowledge of language, but knowledge about language. So this is not, you know, how many words you know and how fast you can use them, but it's more sort of abstract knowledge of this is a system, that you have labels for things, they can be combined in certain ways and so on. So I'll just give you an example of what I actually mean by this. You know, we have a concept and everyone knows the concept, but what metalinguistic knowledge is going to tell you is that there is nothing intrinsic in this label that links to this concept. So these particular three letters, or the combination of those, you know, that there isn't anything that linking it intrinsically to the concept of dog. Or, I'll give you an example, you can have some really big words, minuscule, it's huge, it's referring to something small. Or you can have like big, it's referring to something, you know, a small word to something big. So in the same way, there isn't that sort of direct link. It's effectively idiosyncratic, what a link between a label and a concept. And that obviously becomes, you know, clear when you take into account that that same concept has been called different things, depending on which language you use. And the idea is that this is something that bilinguals just by default are going to be sort of grasping easier, because there isn't that sort of direct link between that label and that object. So theory of mind it's sort of knowledge about other people's beliefs, or awareness that other people might know things differently from you, And as a result, they might be behaving differently than you are behaving. So just awareness of, not everyone knows the same things as I do. And this is something that just develops over time. So your average 3-year-old is going to assume that everyone knows what they know, and they should be behaving, so they're going to be surprised if you do something that sort of doesn't agree with their view of the world. So if there is data to suggest, and there seem to be, that there is some effect on the ability to manage conflicting demands, I mean, this is clearly beneficial, right? So I think this is a fairly common sense argument that, being able to focus on something, focus your attention, to not be distracted by interfering information and so on. This has been shown in study after study that this has positive consequence for, whether it's maths or reading or basically a whole range of disciplines. So that's obvious in a way. The less obvious one, but I think equally interesting, are these two. So sensitivity to social cues. So this is what I was showing you now with this sort of theory of mind, being able to sort of understand others' beliefs, or just in general context of sort of in order to choose which language to use, you need to be aware of the environment, as in who you're talking to, what you're talking about, and so on. And it has been argued that this can be sort of capitalized upon, this can be used to boost knowledge. So bilingual kids are going to be, this is sort of their trait from the experience of being bilingual. So they're going to be sort of very well prepared to learn from social contexts, from environment, from interaction, role play, joint activity, and those sorts of things. So in a way, pre-existing trait that can be used in order to boost acquisition of knowledge. And then we have this sort of meta-linguistic knowledge, so this knowledge of language and sort of more abstract, not direct link between a label and a concept. So again, it has been argued that this can be used to promote deeper understanding of categories, so how to learn language. So, for instance, if you are introducing different breeds of dogs, so if you just look at these, I mean, they look very different from each other, and having this sort of direct link, okay, so here is a dog, is going to exclude this, but sort of not having that one-to-one mapping is going to potentially allow deeper understanding of concepts, so extracting what's the essence of a category, right, of a dog or any other concepts. So in a way, pre-existing traits that can be used to promote deeper understanding of concepts and creation of categories. And what you can see here is that these data seems to suggest yes. So there is this sort of increase in how long it takes people to respond from about 60s onwards in the bilinguals, and it sort of kicks in much earlier in monolinguals. So what this seems to suggest is that monolinguals are showing more decline in cognitive control due to aging than bilinguals. So possibly, some effect of in this sense as well. So again, this is quite cool. I mean, these are very promising data. And then finally, same thing has been looked at in patients. So these are patients with dementia. So progressive disease that affects all sorts of cognitive processes, including cognitive control. And there is about 100 patients in each group, monolingual and bilingual. And then what these researchers have reported is that when they compared the two groups, there is something like 4.5 to 5 years difference in the onset of symptoms in one group over the other.